Let's talk about gaming in the 90s. Let's talk about my journey through gaming. If you guys remember the last video, we talked about the SNES and my experiences with that. Well, guess what? You candy-ass bitches. We're not talking about baby toys anymore, okay? We're getting into the serious, edgy shit. That's right, folks. Today, we are going to be talking about the one and only Sega Genesis, the cool guys console.
What the heck was that? Forgot what I was going to say.
Welcome to the next level.
If you guys remember, in my SNES video, I made it pretty clear that I was on Nintendo's side in the console war of the 90s. In fact, if you've watched my channel, you've probably come to the conclusion that I am very much partial to Nintendo. But that does not mean that I still did not dabble in the dark arts, aka playing Sega Genesis. I mean, the fact is, we may have gotten into fights in the schoolyard, we may have gotten into debates about which console was better, but if I'm over at a friend's house and they have a Sega Genesis, yeah, I'm gonna play it, and I'm gonna have fun with it. I mean, my older brother also had a Sega Genesis, and, you know, he was a teen at the time, so he was definitely cooler than me, you know? He did all kinds of cool things, like go to Star Trek conventions, and read comics, and played Star Trek in the basement with his friends. Look, I'm kind of making fun of my older brother, but he was actually cool. He would oftentimes let me play Star Trek with him. Oftentimes I had to be a Ferengi. We all played all kinds of different consoles, except for the TurboGrafx 16. The only kid that had it was Keith. Inside joke from the last video, Keith was weird and he had a TurboGrafx. Let's dive right into this. A good chunk of this is going to be games that I played as a kid, but there's also going to be quite a few games that I played as an adult, because like I said, I didn't have a Sega Genesis of my own. My brother would let me play his fairly often, but, you know, most of my gaming was on my Super Nintendo at the time. So when I got older, though, that's when I kind of started going into the back catalog of Sega Genesis games. So we'll do a section where I talk about games that I played as a kid, and then we'll kind of get into a section where we talk about games I played as an adult. Okay, so first let's talk about the design of the Sega Genesis. What a just absolutely beautiful console. Little secret, to this day, I don't think that there is a better designed console in terms of aesthetics than the original Sega Genesis. I love the angles on it, I love the black, I love the little red accent in North America, I love the little high definition graphics that was printed around the early versions. In the North America, you know, the Genesis in North America had that 16-bit badge there, but it was a little bit smaller and less blocky than the Japanese Mega Drive. It just was such a good looking console. It's one of those things that, like, honestly, in the late 80s, early 90s, you could put that in your entertainment center next to your hi-fi audio equipment, and that would fit right in. It would look right at home, you know, next to a Sony CD player from the 80s or the 90s. Just chef's kiss. Just absolutely, absolutely beautiful. It's just very clear when you set the original Sega Genesis next to the Super Famicom, or the Famicom, or the NES, or the Super Nintendo. It's very clear that Sega was targeting an older audience, that they were trying to make something that looked elegant, whereas Nintendo was trying to make something, you know, their products were very boxy and almost toy-like, and very clearly communicating, hey, this is something for everybody, this is fun, you know, whereas the Sega Genesis, I feel like, is like, this thing's sexy. It's sexy. I'm just realizing that the word sexy sounds really gross coming out of my mouth. Which explains why for the last 9 years, every time I've called my wife sexy, she's responded with a grimace. You had the Mark II, you had the Mark III, then you had the Sega CDX, which combined the Sega CD with the 32X. Quick note from editing Josh here. It didn't actually combine the Sega CD with the 3DX. The X in the CDX threw me off. It's actually just an original Genesis combined with a Sega CD, and it was also a semi-portable CD player, so I apologize for my mistake. Forgiveness, please. The Mark II looked okay. That was actually the version of the Genesis that my brother had. It looked fine, and I believe it shipped with the 6-button controller, at least the one that my brother had. I think there were other iterations as well. I can't even keep track of all of them.
2つの CPU が同時に動く未来製のパソコンテラドライブ
楽しい賢い
And I know that this is going to be kind of an interesting take. I think most people would say that the 6-button controller for the Genesis is better. Makes sense, right? Because you've got 6 buttons, which means you could play all of the games, including the fighting games, without having to do weird things like press start to switch between punches and kicks in Street Fighter. They were also a little bit smaller and a little bit more comfortable in the hand. I think most people would prefer the 6-button controllers. But not me, man. This bad boy right here. This is one of my all-time favorite gamepads. I love the original Sega Genesis gamepad. I love the D-pad on it. I love all of the accents that you get on it, the red accents. And then I love these triggers, man, because that's what they were called. They weren't called buttons, they were called triggers. And they're big and round, and they kind of remind you of arcade triggers, which makes complete sense because the Sega Genesis was built off of Sega's arcade system at the time. And so there's just a real nice feeling when you press those triggers. I don't know, it feels good to me. When Sega Genesis launched in Japan and North America, it was originally going up against 2 main pieces of competition. The first was NEC's offering, the TurboGrafx 16, which was technically a 16-bit machine. It was certainly a step above the NES. And then its other main piece of competition would have been the Famicom or the NES, which was an 8-bit system that the Sega Genesis was, just absolutely in every way superior to. So for its first year or so on the market, the Sega Genesis, basically could market itself on the fact that, hey, look, here's some 16-bit action. You can get games, ports of arcade games that are going to look much closer to the originals than they do on the NES. And you can see that in the original marketing. The earliest marketing for the Sega Genesis in North America was all about bring the arcade home.
Dave Whitney wanted the real arcade games at home, so he got them. Mike Rogers wanted them too, but he got a Genesis system by Sega. Why? Check it out. Arcade screen left, Genesis screen right. If they look the same, you've answered correctly. Besides, Genesis has real-life action in sports games, flying games, and adventure games. The hottest library going. So if you want real arcade action, there's only 2 ways to get it.
Dave, we got your golden axe.
Or get Genesis by Sega. We bring the arcade experience home.
Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Look at how much better this looks than the NES. And then the Super Nintendo came out, and while the Sega Genesis has a faster processor than the Super Nintendo, the Super Nintendo is pretty much objectively better in every single aspect. It has more channels of audio. I think it's 8 versus 6. It's got more RAM. It's got more available colors. It's got more colors that you can have on screen at a time. Now, that's not to say that the Super Nintendo was like miles ahead of the Sega Genesis, but it was superior in a lot of ways. The marketing push for the Sega Genesis pivoted, where they talked about, look at this processing that we've got. Of course, there's the famous blast processing, which was a way to up efficiency for running instructions in gaming that gave you better performance.
So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
But yeah, Sega marketed the Genesis as being faster than the Super Nintendo, and it worked. I believed that 100%. Now I can look at the Sega Genesis and see how, it's not quite as advanced as the Super Nintendo. It doesn't have all the same graphical modes that the Super Nintendo has. It has its own style of gaming, and it feels better. Like, here's the deal. Shoot 'em ups feel 10 times better on the Genesis to me than they do on the Super Nintendo. And so do arcade action games. Like, any game that has a lot of action going on the screen at once feels much better. The Super Nintendo had a huge problem with slowdown, and you didn't get that as much on the Sega Genesis. So I feel like that kind of balanced out a little bit. In terms of audio, I'd just like to say this too. I prefer the Super Nintendo's audio chip, I think, but that's kind of a personal choice. Yeah, the Super Nintendo has a chip that was custom made by Sony that allows for some pretty good sounding music. I feel like the Super Nintendo in particular does really good orchestral sounding music. Whereas the Sega Genesis, if you're getting into a synth type music, Sega Genesis sounds so much better because the Sega Genesis actually has an onboard synthesizer, so that makes complete sense. So both consoles end up having a very distinct sound, and I love those distinct sounds. If there's one thing that I love about the Genesis, and what I love about Sega, and in particular, I love the audacity that they had to take on Nintendo, who had a complete control of the video game market when Sega introduced the Genesis. And the fact that Sega was able to wrestle so much of the market share from Nintendo, to the point that they were almost 50-50 for a good chunk of the 90s. Now, ultimately, the Super Nintendo would end up outselling the Sega Genesis, but I would say that both of them have equally impressive legacies now. And for those of us who grew up with both of them, you know, who maybe threw our lot in with one over the other, like I threw my lot in over the Super Nintendo, but I know plenty of people who liked the Genesis over the Super Nintendo, and that love is very deep. It was an exciting time for gaming, and that's what I love about the Genesis, is it's just so emblematic of the video game market sort of evolving and growing up and becoming more edgy, which we're going to talk about. The early years of the Genesis, I was mainly drawn to a lot of licensed games. In other words, games that featured characters that I recognized. This was the golden age of Disney games. You know, the first and earliest Disney game that probably comes to mind for most people on the Genesis is Mickey Mouse Castle of Illusion. It was a pretty early game in the Genesis library, and it looked impressive for the time. I mean, just look at the emotion on his face. It's a deep cut to the Computer Chronicles.
Oh, look at the emotions on his face. Yes. You know, that's what's really making the difference between this generation of video game system and the, you know, generation...
Yeah, and the relative depth of that background, too.
That is a nerd's nerd show. I'm just... Anyways, Castle of Illusion is great, but it is not my favorite Mickey Mouse game on the Genesis, nor is Mickey Mania. My favorite Mickey Mouse game on the Genesis will forever be World of Illusion, because my brother actually had that game. He would let me play it by myself, but he would also play it with me. So I have a lot of good memories of us playing as Mickey and Donald, and it's honestly, the single player campaign is really short, and it's not, in my opinion, like the best designed platformer. But it does have a whole crap ton of Disney charm. I love the music in this game, and I love the sound effects. And my favorite level by far is The Office. It has some real through the mirror vibes, which is my favorite Mickey Mouse short. So yeah, it's fun. Plus you get to go into a cookie box. This It was a very magical game, and as a kid, it, got my imagination racing. Of course, if we're talking about Disney games on the Sega Genesis, we can't move forward without talking about Aladdin. Now, in my SNES video, I talked about Aladdin, and I said that it kind of changes upon the day as to whether I prefer the Genesis version to the SNES version, because they are very different. The Genesis version is more action-based. Aladdin has his sword, in addition to being able to throw apples, so it's more of a side-scrolling adventure, whereas Aladdin on the SNES is more of just your regular sort of platformer where you're hopping on enemies. Both games have their pros and cons. One thing that the Genesis version has over the SNES version is personality. I love the animations of Aladdin, of all the different characters. I love that when you get a guard to run across the hot coals, he'll jump across because he's hurting his feet. I don't know, there's a lot of humor and a lot of personality in this game. I definitely believe that Aladdin is one of the best games on the Sega Genesis. I would recommend it to anybody. Of course, there were also the sort of dual releases. These were Disney games that were pretty much the same on the SNES and the Sega Genesis. So you had like Toy Story, The Lion King, and the other ones, I don't know, they were fine. They were there, they were great for rentals, right? Another licensed game that I remember playing quite a bit is Jurassic Park. And this is one instance where the Genesis version is way better than the SNES version, in my humble opinion. And that's for one simple reason. You can play as a mother effing raptor. That's right. There's two missions. You got one where you're Dr. Grant, you're trying to escape all the dinosaurs, and then you got one where you're a raptor, and your goal is just to hunt down Dr. Grant. Like, how awesome is that? The game looks really cool. It's pretty fun to play. It's got a great atmosphere. I feel like it does a really good job of capturing the atmosphere of the movie. It's a fantastic movie tie-in game. One of the rare fantastic movie tie-in games from that era. Of course, one of the most famous licensed games of the time. I guess it's a licensed game? Yeah, it's a licensed game. Is Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, where you play as Michael Jackson. Michael! Rescuing children. What a weird game, man. Like, it is a really strange game to go back and play. The strangest thing about this game is how much I love it. I can't tell you why. There's nothing too terribly compelling about the gameplay loop. You basically just go through every level trying to find little girls until a monkey points you to a secret door. That's a very strange sentence that just came out of my mouth. Music's great. Like, I think this does a really good job of demonstrating the strength of the Sega Genesis onboard synthesizer. I'm not going to get into all the controversies of Michael Jackson, but I will say that this game is like a snapshot of time when everybody loved Michael Jackson. And I mean everybody. Like in that episode of The Simpsons, Stark Raving Dad, when everybody gets so fetching stoked about Michael Jackson being there, yeah, that is like the most realistic thing that has ever happened on The Simpsons. That's how much people loved Michael Jackson at the time. Real quick, I just want to touch on Animaniacs. My friend had Animaniacs. I didn't get to play it much. I was so jealous of my friend because I had Animaniacs on the SNES and that game just failed to impress. And compare it to the Animaniacs on the Genesis, oh, it is so much better on the Genesis. If you're looking for an Animaniacs game, highly recommend going with the Genesis version. But the licensed game that I remember the most from that era sorry, it's just kind of embarrassing. The licensed game I remember most from that era was McDonald's Treasureland Adventure. Cause that was the era that we lived in. You know, in the early kind of mid-ish 90s, McDonald's went in hard on marketing toward children. Which is pretty messed up when you think about how addictive their food is and how just utterly unhealthy it is. But like, I remember having a birthday party at a McDonald's and it was magical AF. You know, you still had like the McDonald's land and all the magical creatures like Grimace and the Hamburglar and Bird Lady and McNuggets and fetching the Constable Cheeseburger, who for some reason you could climb inside his head at certain McDonald's. Anyways, that's not important. As part of their marketing push, there was a game released on the Sega Genesis, and I rented this game quite often, and I loved it. It's a platformer, pretty simple platformer. I was playing it on an emulator, and I think the version I was playing originally was a ROM hack, because like the store that you go into to get upgrades was an actual McDonald's, and your health was hamburgers, and like shakes were your power-ups, and except for your magical power-up, that was just a sperm. I mean, what else is that? That's a sperm, right? It made a whole lot more sense. Like, there's one boss where you have to sacrifice your health to him in order to hurt him, which is a really dark theme in a kid's game, but anyway, it makes a lot more sense when your health is hamburgers. You know, you're feeding him hamburgers to distract him. I finally realized this was a ROM hack, and so I ended up playing the Japanese version for no other reason than the fact that in the North American version, they fixed the magical power-up so it didn't look so much like a sperm. I wanted to play the Japanese version because it looked like a sperm, because I'm a very, very immature person. It's a fun game. Like, is it the greatest platformer ever made? No. Does it have some really weird, surreal moments in it? Yeah, it really does. Why the hell is Swan Lake playing here? What is going on? But ultimately, it's a charming, fun little game that I'm sure lots of little kids had fun with. I remember having fun with it. And ultimately, it's innocent, you know? There's nothing... Oh, holy shit! Japan! I know this was the 90s, but even in the 90s, man, you can't be doing this! You guys, this video is getting pretty darn long, and so you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go ahead and split this up. Give it a week, and part 2 is gonna be coming out. Let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite Sega Genesis memory? What is your favorite Sega Genesis game? And if you liked this video, please leave me a like. It definitely helps the channel. You could also join the crew of the USS Super Rad, which I guess is what I'm calling my Patreons. Go to my Patreon, check it out. You can join. I am still working on what the reward is going to be, apart from the main reward, which is getting a shout out. So Chloe Smith, my one and only patron on Patreon, thank you so much for joining. It is very much appreciated. I mean, you know, don't you want to hear me say your name like I just said, Chloe Smith? You know, of course you do. Anyways, stay tuned, folks, for the exciting conclusion. I mean, what games am I gonna talk about? You know? Am I gonna bring up effing Vector Man? You're gonna have to tune in to find out.